I'm going to talk to you about how to get one of the most important nutrients for your soil in your soil naturally. And we're also going to talk about bacterial inoculants. You may have no idea what that is. If you do, we're going to find out, does it actually work? Is it beneficial for your soil and for the yield of your soil? And we're also going to talk about a little history, and you're going to want to watch all the way through to find out some fascinating information on a little scientific study that I did. Hey everybody, Chad Cruiser here with Health and Homestead. And let's start off with a little history. This is very important to help you understand, and maybe you already know these things, but it'll help you just give a little refresher on your American history and also the importance of crop rotations. Maybe you've heard of George Washington Carver. Maybe that brings you back to your American history class in high school. George Washington Carver, yes, the greatest, probably one of the greatest scientists of the 1800s, and for sure the most prominent black scientist of that time period. Great man. If you haven't read a book on the history of him, fantastic story to read about this incredible man. But he had a very serious difficulty that was staring him right in the face. And what was that? The problem George Washington Carver was seeing all over the South was that, you see, the African Americans, these former slaves, had been working on cotton fields for years, and year after year they had been planting the very same crop, and that was causing trouble. Actually, they had run out of basically largely nitrogen from the soils there in the South, and so the new crops were just pathetic. Planting other things, things just weren't growing well. So you had this terrible soil in the South, and George Washington Carver, who lived from the 1860s to World War II, he sought out to find, through research, through studies, what would actually give life and nutrition back to the soil. And one of the things he realized that the soil needed was nitrogen. And nitrogen is all around us. Right now, you're not seeing it, but it's all around me. And it's actually all around you. You're breathing it in right now. I'm breathing it in. I'm breathing it out as I talk to you. And the trouble is, the good thing is this feeds the plant. The nitrogen feeds the plants, but the plants can't get it from the air. It's just not something that is usable to the plants when it is in the air. So something has to happen, and that's what George Washington Carver was looking into, and he discovered something that would be very helpful to give life to the soil, to give nitrogen to the soil. So George Washington Carver discovered that in the roots of certain plants, there was something that could help turn the nitrogen from the environment around it into something that could actually be put into the soil and could be usable to the plants. And that was found, in general, he found in what we now call nitrogen fixers. And what is that? There are certain plants, things like legumes. There's actually several different kind of plants. Here on my property I have growing wild the autumn olive. The autumn olive is also a nitrogen fixer. What does that mean? It means these certain plants actually take nitrogen from the air through a process with bacteria. Certain plants in their roots harbor a certain beneficial bacteria, and the bacteria then creates what's called a symbiotic relationship with the plant. Symbiosis, symbiotic. That sounds like something I learned in school. What was it? Basically, it's a mutually beneficial relationship between the bacteria and the plants themselves. And so this bacteria that would be in the roots of the plants would actually help convert the nitrogen from the air into the ground, and you can actually see it there on the plants. You can actually dig up the roots and you can see these little nodules, they're called, and you can actually, it kind of looks like maybe even a disease, but it's not a disease. It's actually where the nitrogen is being stored, and it can be either used for that plant, or if that plant dies, it could be used for future generations of plants. But what does it do? Well, nitrogen is extremely important for the growing of plants, and when plants get low in nitrogen, they'll often start to become, they'll have yellowing in their leaves and so forth. So they need enough nitrogen, and certain crops can actually benefit this to the future generations, and that's specifically beans. Now, some actually say that if you let the beans grow all the way until they actually have the beans themselves, that nitrogen will largely go to that plant and those beans. But what what you can do is you can actually leave the beans, you can plant them later in the fall or a fall crop, and as they begin to grow, the frost will finally kill them before they actually go to having a bean, and the plant will die, but it will leave that nitrogen in the soil for next year's plant. So you can plant plants like you normally would during the season, and then when those plants are done, you can pull them up or harvest them, and then you plant beans as we would call it a cover crop, and that would end up being, or maybe like a green manure, and that would be used where you till it into the soil at the end of the year or in next spring, and that will be used to leave the nitrogen from that plant in the soil for the next plants that you're going to grow there in your garden. So one of the things that George Washington Carver began to teach the people of the South was, hey, instead of planting the same crop, the same cash crop year after year after year, because you make so much money off of it, instead what you're going to have to do is do something called crop rotations, where one year you may plant your, cash crop, but another year you're going to have to plant some kind of nitrogen fixer or a bean or a legume or something like peanuts or the other form of bean. And so that's exactly what he taught them to do, and this began to revitalize the soil there in the South. So this is extremely important. One of the most important things you could do as a gardener, especially if you're looking to go the organic route as much as possible, is to learn to do crop rotations. And I'm going to do a whole video in the future on crop rotations, and it's very, very important to keep down the disease pressure or potentially even the pressure from pests, bugs, insects, and so forth. So crop rotations are super important, but let's go back to talking about this issue of bacteria in the soil along with nitrogen in the soil, which is imperative. What I actually tried was this. People say that by putting something called a bacterial inoculant, what they do is you can actually buy these packages of bacteria that you plant with your beans, or you actually take the beans as your seeds and put them in the bacteria, and they will actually help you to get more nitrogen in the soil and give you a higher yield with your beans, legumes, or nitrogen-fixing plants. But the question is, does it actually work? I did my own test. I call it scientific, but I'm not a scientist, so it's not really scientific, but I would call it my own scientific test. Did it work? Is it worth your time, or is it a waste of money? I'm going to show you my results. So what I did is I planted a small planting of beans. I think like maybe 108, 112 different plants, and I divided them into two areas. One area, I added a bacterial inoculant that was purchased at the garden store, or actually it was at like a tractor supply company kind of thing, and so I bought something. This was just a little test to see, would it be beneficial? Is it worth the money to buy bacterial inoculants? And I gotta say, I am naturally a skeptic. So, if some corporation is selling something that they say helps out your, growing of things, I think it might work, might not, but I also think, hey, okay, for thousands of years, people did not have some little package of bacteria. Now, what is a bacterial inoculant? Basically, it's different strains of bacteria that they claim are beneficial to the soil if you haven't planted beans or legumes in several years, that they say by adding this bacteria to the soil, it'd be beneficial to get a higher yield to your beans. And so I think, well, is that really true? So I can't say that I'm totally non-biased. I'm not a scientist, but scientists are just humans, and they kind of have their opinions too. And so I had my opinion. I was a skeptic, but I'm going to show you. So I went and planted it. At the end of the season, I harvested it, and then I measured it out. But before I tell you, I got to tell you real quickly. I waited a little too long to harvest them, so some of them got moldy. Bummer, my fault. And I should have picked them before the rains really came. But because I didn't, some of them got moldy, but I separated them into the moldy ones, the non-moldy ones, but I still waited all together so that I was finding out, well, which is better, the inoculated or non-inoculated? What was the difference? I'm going to show you now. What I found was this. I got 1.51 pounds of the non-inoculated beans, and I got 1.762 pounds of the inoculated beans. So I did get more with the inoculated. If you do the math, it's something like 16.7% more with the inoculant. So is it more? Yes. Is it significant? it's really up to you whether that's enough to make such a significant impact on your garden. And the thing is, you don't have to do it every year. You really only have to do it one time, as long as every few years you plant beans again. It's supposed to be in the soil, so it's really only needs to be like a one-time deal. It's just if you haven't used it for years. So would I do it again? I'm not really sure that I would, at least not in that area. You can see that it's not a necessity. You get your beans either way. How much is it going to affect next year's plants in the inoculated versus the non-inoculant area? I don't really know. So it's really up to you whether you think it's important enough. And, you know, you're going to have to make your own decisions, but it's always nice to know somebody else's experience. I've gone through the work myself to give an idea. By the way, beans are not the only way you can add nitrogen to the soil. Another thing is rain. When it rains out, you just notice your plants look so much better, because in the rainwater is actually nitrogen. And so that's put in the soil at that time, and that's why it looks so much better than when you water your garden with the water hose from your well or the municipal water or whatever. It just looks way better because you get the nitrogen with the rainwater. That's why using catchment systems can be a great way if you're doing a relatively small area. And secondarily, you can use manure or you can use compost. By the way, I'm going to be having a video coming out in the research and science of composting coming up. You're not going to want to miss that. But if you like this video, you're going to want to hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, share it with somebody. God bless and have a fantastic day. What had been happening, that instead they would begin to do what we call, what do we call it? You'd think I'd remember. Crop rotations, come on. How could I not remember that? Crop rotations. I knew that. But as I was recording, I didn't. So let's go back.